Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining our EDC Coffee Chat, Coffee with Colleen. We are very honored this morning to have our leaders of our police forces with us today. We have Sheriff Brian King and Chief of Police Brian Smith and Chief of Police Sheri. Oh, shame on me. It looks like Sheri Crain left the meeting. Yes, I thought she had left the meeting, but she has not. So we're really happy to have the three of you on today. I know there's a lot happening in Olympia, and we have a lot of things going on locally that concern citizens, and it does to some level affect certainly our economy, especially drug use. And so we would love to hear about that and just be informed. And again, I really appreciate everyone joining today. So with that, just a few housekeeping items. If you would keep yourselves on mute unless you are speaking. Really appreciate that, so we don't inadvertently pick up any background noise. And then also, and if you have a question, you can either raise your hand and call on you, or alternatively, you can put your question in the chat if you'd prefer just to have your question asked. So we are going to start off with Sheriff Brian King. Sheriff, go right ahead. Take it away.
Well, thank you, Colleen. There's always a lot of topics that the chief and sheriffs like to talk about with our public. I'm going to focus on, we'll begin by focusing on just legislation in Olympia this session, and how our professional association, the Washington Association of Sheriffs and Police Chiefs, keeps us as your law enforcement leaders organized when we follow what's occurring in Olympia. And so just as a generic overview, we started the session through our association with really about 5 pressing priorities that affect public safety in our communities. Unfortunately, we're down to about 2 bills left. 3 of the 5 are dead, and so we are closely following those 2 bills, and those 2 bills have to deal with drug possession in our communities and then pursuits. And so those are the really pressing 2 bills that are alive. There's a lot of other bills outside that we continue to track. At this point in the session, things are changing almost daily. There's hearings, there's conversations occurring. And so the texts of these bills are constantly changing, and that requires us to have quite a bit of due diligence. So on Fridays, every Friday, we get a brief on what occurred that week, as well as opportunities throughout the week to testify on the different bills. So the 2 bills I want to touch on that we're closely monitoring right now is Senate Bill 5536, which covers drug possession. And House Bill 1363, which addresses pursuits. And so when I talk about Senate Bill 5536, this is a bill that will essentially, once again, criminalize drug possession, so simple drug possession. Now, when I say criminalize, currently it's still illegal to possess controlled substances, but we cannot arrest. So that's the simplest way of describing that. What we are hoping for as law enforcement leaders, and this is speaking for me as sheriff, and I'm confident that Brian and Sheri seeing some of the same thoughts as I do, is that we need to have a mechanism to put folks who are openly using drugs in our community in jail. And the reason for that being is that change only occurs when you incentivize folks to change their behavior. And jail is one of those locations. Now there's a lot of discussion out there over how does that really affect change. You know, you're just incarcerating folks and they're leaving our jail to go back right out and do drugs. Well, that's not what is occurring in our jail. And, you know, the message I'm trying to get out there is we have a robust MOUD program, which is medication for opioid use disorder. We're providing treatment services in our jail. We're really trying to break that cycle of incarceration and make the jail an institution of positive change. That only occurs if we can get people that need to be arrested into jail with the opportunity for treatment. And then we need that hammer. We need that hammer to be able to say, folks, you're in jail, you've hit rock bottom, it's time to make a change. We don't have those tools right now. And then when I talk about pursuits, House Bill 1363, currently we are very restricted on what we can pursue, and it's really for violent crimes only. So we're not able to effectively address the property crime epidemic that we do see in our communities. And while this bill does not give us everything that we need, it is an improvement. And so we still support the bill. Now, even with the drug possession legislation that we're seeing and the pursuit legislation that we're seeing, there is changes occurring every single day. And it could get to the point to where we're not gonna support those bills because they don't really make positive change. They don't give us the tools to do our job. And that's why we're so engaged right now in the process as we look through this. And so I think I've talked enough, and I'll turn it over to Brian for some comments.
Yeah, so thanks, Brian. You know, the legislative story, when you hear us talk about it, might sound like we're complaining or we're a broken record. But so I've been doing this 42 years. Up until 2 years ago, I relied on my association, Association of Washington Sheriffs, Police Chiefs, and also the Association of Washington Cities to be our advocates. And I would, stay informed and, like Brian said, be engaged. But really 2 years ago, what I saw coming out of Olympia, and I'll see if I can state this in a way that reflects me accurately. I wasn't going to be able to participate in this profession in Washington based on what initially came out in 2021, the language. My daughter would have finished her senior year in another zip code. And that was a really hard decision for me to make. But that's literally what we started out with in 2021. It was that bad. Now, to the credit of our legislators, many of them listened. It took a lot of time, energy, and engagement to get us really to where we are now. We're not I wouldn't say I'm happy, but I mean, I was able to stay in Washington for me and to lead the women and men here and not feel like I'm doing something that I just can't tolerate or accept. Like Brian said, this stuff changes day to day. But one of the concepts that's really important is, we have in Washington and in the US, we have government that divides itself down to the local level. So everything that's happened in the last 3 sessions, even if it's stuff that Sheri and Brian and I don't agree with, from restricting traffic stops to anything you can think of, it could all be adopted at the local level. So if you don't want us to pursue people at all, that's something you can do at a local level. If you don't want us to stop people for equipment violations, what happened in 2021 is things that would have been normally policy and they would have reflected differences in communities became law. The use of force that was passed, the restrictions on pursuit. So policy migrated into law and it applied to all of us really across the board, one size fits all. That's been a big challenge. And, even amongst like Sheri, Brian, and I, we communicate a lot. We agree on most things, but we have the freedom to have different policies within our organizations and to have different, ways we could do sort of the same thing. There's nothing wrong with that. But what we came up with in 2021 was really a substantial, like this is how it's going to be for all of you. So at 2 o'clock in the morning, regardless of whether it's safe to pursue someone, if it's not the type of crime that's listed specifically and you don't have probable cause to arrest for it, you can't pursue the vehicle. So that's been the challenge, is to break some of that stuff down and in a way return us back to how we functioned, I think very, very well in the state of Washington previously. I think there's a lot of positive things happening. Brian and I went down and spent the day about a month and a half ago at Olympia, like many of you do at Legislative Day. And I think we had a pretty positive interaction with our two representatives and our senator. But for us, for like till further notice, at least for me, for further notice, every time the legislature's in session, I'm going to have to spend a lot of my time and energy watching carefully what's going on, engaging with our legislators. There's a couple of bills that were so bad that I told my city manager, I'm going to go spend the night and get a room and testify in person. I testified in person this year and last year and the year before. I'd never done that in my entire career. I never felt the need to. I mean, it's actually not, it's something that we should all consider. But for our future is essentially every legislative session having to be very, very engaged. I don't believe the energy that's driving some of this is going to change. And I'll just leave you with this. We're stuck with something happens 2,000 miles from here in a state that we don't control the hiring standards, the training. We don't control any of it, but we happen to wear uniforms that look similar. And really all it takes for us is something like that to happen. And we're back off to the races, unfortunately. Separating us from other states and other places that do things very differently than us is a big challenge. So I think that'll leave it with that, and I'll turn it over to Sheri if she's got anything to add.
I do. I'll kind of switch gears a little bit. A lot of this case law, a lot of the legislative changes, a lot of the negative police work that's happened around the country that have gotten us to this place has been from police officers interacting with mentally ill people who have substance abuse issues, who are homeless. So, and I wouldn't categorize the vast majority of our contacts are to the positive, right? But a lot of that is steering what is happening in the law enforcement reform world. But what I will tell you is, in addition to the police legislation that's out there, there's been significant legislation on the social service side of the house. So I think there's still bills out there that we're watching to make sure that you're putting your money where your mouth is. If you want law enforcement to slow down, process things slower, don't confront, don't arrest, don't do, there's got to be something happening on the other end of the spectrum. And I think that we aren't getting credit for the things that we've been doing proactively for years. Brian Smith gets a lot of credit for starting the rediscovery program, getting us the grant that brought us those services here. Charlie Bush with the city of Sequim gets credit for Sequim Health and Housing Collaborative. The teamwork, collaboration, and communication amongst social service workers in the field and law enforcement. The jail's been doing yeoman's work for years through Bill Benedict, just years they've been doing great work in the jail. So we're ahead of the game out here in many, many ways. And the way I think about it is that we have through that teamwork and collaboration and communication really tightened up what we can control and what we can affect. But we're getting to the point where the people who are in the field, they ask, what do you need? Well, I need treatment. Well, they can't find treatment beds. Well, I need mental health services. There's no mental health beds. There's no housing. There's no emergency housing, no transitory housing. So I think this is an interesting period of time that we're living through, and there's a lot of work to be done. And I think it's really maybe unfortunate how it came about. The fact is, we have an opportunity as a community and as a state to face the gaps in services that we have and try to fix that. So legislation to potentially get crisis care centers where we can drop off people who are in desperate, immediate crisis and then mental health treatment beds for sure, as well as substance abuse treatment beds. I know Rebecca Miller can speak to this. There's probably a few other people online, but it's important to remind people there is 0 treatment beds for either substance abuse addiction or mental health on the peninsula, period. End of story. You got to go somewhere else for that. So anyway, that's where I would conclude with that. And there's probably a lot of other things we need to talk about today as well, unless somebody's got questions about it.
Brian, you mentioned that you started with 5 bills and 3 haven't made it through cutoff. What were those 3 that didn't move forward?
And Brian and Sheri will have to help me a little bit with this because I kind of, exit out the back of my mind when we fail. But one had to do with access to juveniles, and so the ability to have a interview juveniles when they're suspected of committing crimes. And so right now, we have legislation that essentially states that they have an affirmative right to have counsel represent them. And so essentially what that does is it does prohibit law enforcement from having a investigatory conversation. I don't like to use the word interrogation. It can simply be an interview, but we don't have access to be able to interview juveniles right now. Now, the legislation simply says that we must provide them with access to an attorney immediately. But what that really states is that when they consult with attorney prior to having a conversation with law enforcement, the attorneys say do not have the conversation with law enforcement, and that significantly delays our ability to conduct our investigations.
So question about that, does that mean like if there were a car wreck and kids probably saw it, you can't say, hey, did you see what happened? You can't say that to them?
No, only
or
if
is it you can't take them back to the police station?
Only if they're the suspect of that investigation. And so we can still conduct our investigation and utilize witnesses to try to determine that. Where it becomes a little gray is in law enforcement out in the field trying to determine who is a suspect and who is a witness. And when they get to that point, that we know that they are a suspect, we're going to err always on the side of caution. Even, respecting everybody's rights, that requires us to provide that access to an attorney. And in return, we know what attorneys will always advise their clients, which is don't talk to the police. So it significantly delays our ability to do our investigations. But even what is even more important to highlight is that we don't see that effect as much here in Clallam County, but we see it statewide where criminal organizations utilize those laws to their advantage. And especially in our more urban areas of our county or in our state where we see street gangs and car thefts running rampant. These criminal organizations are utilizing juveniles to go out and commit these ill deeds, knowing that law enforcement is not going to be able to have those conversations with them, therefore not tying them back to the criminal organization. So it really affects the overall spectrum of public safety. And that's the point I'm trying to make there. Number 2 is, this was probably the most exciting bill for me that I was tracking. And I thought that there was a lot of bipartisan support. I thought it was a reality, but it was returning 0.1% sales tax back to the local jurisdictions to focus on recruiting and retention and providing law enforcement services to the community. This wasn't a new tax. This is a 0.1% tax credit, which would have been amazing as it affects recruiting and retention in our communities. That died, and that's unfortunate. Brian, do you know the 5th bill I'm missing?
I can't think of the 5th good bill. There was a piece that was another part of recruiting retention that would have also funded our body worn cameras, which were, many of us, a $500,000 capital project, which is what body worn cameras, at least for us, will cost us in 5 years. That's a pretty big lift. That bill, I think, was also a recruitment and retention, trying to think how the word, it's like incentive. That also didn't get out of committee. But Colleen, there's two bad ones that got killed that I just want to focus on because it gives you the flavor of why we can't stop thinking about this stuff all the time. I mean, the good one that Brian just talked about, it was really unfortunate that we lost 0.1%. Our city council supported that. Our mayor, Kate Dexter, testified in favor of it. But a couple of ones that did make it, but they're going to be back, and they create a lot of tension, at least in my workforce, and a lot of stress and a lot of concern. One was House Bill 1025, which would have eliminated qualified immunity for law enforcement. And it's a little bit of a complex and nuanced subject, but we'd be the only one in the criminal justice system that didn't have it. So that's one way to look at it. If it's a good idea to eliminate it for us, it might be a good idea to eliminate it for legislators, judges, attorneys, prosecutors, and defense attorneys. That's obviously not what was proposed. Our insurance risk pool, Washington City's Insurance Authority, sent out a legislative alert on this bill. I talked to their executive director, and their position was this would have made anything below the level of a self-insured entity like the large cities and the state entities uninsurable for liability insurance. So we would, in effect, have to have some kind of reserve bond. Like for Port Angeles, it might be $10 million we'd have to set aside to cover potential liability. We'd probably have to restrict our activities significantly to reduce any potential that we could be sued. So that, I mean, that had some pretty big consequences. And, some people in my workforce were concerned about them being sued more, more liability. And I don't think it would have ever gotten to that point. As a corporate entity, I don't know that we would exist if our insurance risk pool says we can't be insured. But that's the kind of legislation that's considered, and I don't see any evidence that would have solved any problems or made the world any better. The House Bill 1513, which I testified against last year and against this year, and I talked to the original author just because I was really trying to get an understanding of what he was after. This would have restricted traffic stops for anything equipment related, taillights, brake lights, no doors on your car, no seat belts, and some what we would consider moving violations, but the author, I think, didn't think they were moving violations. So, back to policy, if you don't want your police department, your sheriff department to stop someone if their headlights don't work at night, you can certainly do that by policy. But most people in our community expect us to make traffic stops for those things. They're safety related. There was a notion that stops like that have disparate impacts on, different populations. But that doesn't change anything. If I see someone with a headlight that's not working at night, and I lack the ability to make a traffic stop, that bill died. But I think it'll be back. And what's really important to understand is that subject will be talked about in Olympia next year. So the idea of restricting law enforcement statewide from enforcing the law has become something that really after 2021 gets talked about very consistently. And not every state does that. Not every state's talking about that. But in Washington, there's a demographic, there's an interest that wants us to be by law restricted from enforcing certain laws. I'm trying to think, I don't think there's anything else out there that's got the potential this year, but one bill that's still alive is to add a special prosecutor to the Attorney General's office, whose job would be to handle any uses of deadly force by law enforcement. So the fiscal note for that bill is about 20 million a year. And that would take the job that's right now handled by the county prosecutors, you know, reviewing uses of deadly force or the like, to see if it's a violation, to create a special prosecutor just for that. Again, back to recruitment and retention, that doesn't make at least my workforce feel very, very good about the world they're living in, to see that kind of effort being directed at them. They, believe it or not, don't perceive themselves as a problem that warrants that kind of attention. So there's some constitutional issues about that, I'm told, and our prosecutor has spoken out very strongly against it. But it's I think that bill's still alive, and may get some traction going forward.
Well, you know, on Monday, the State Economic and Revenue Forecast Council produced their latest revenue forecast. And so they said for the 2021 to 2023 biennium, it would be actually up 194 million, but they have to do their budgets based on a 4-year cycle. And in the next 2 bienniums, so from 23 to 27, and they start their biennium July 1st. So that's why anyway, it's a weird system. They have predicted that the incoming revenues to the state will be over $1 billion less. So when you talk about 20 million for, you know, these kind of things, and the 1% rebate back to counties to spend money on recruiting and retention, that probably played into things, because the budget writers are looking at $830 million less to play with for their 4-year budget cycle. And Senator Christine Rolfes, the chair of the Ways and Means Committee, she is really hard about, you know, we can't add to expense to the budget, and we can't allow more money taken away from the state budget. So I know that just the 0.09 funds that we get as a rural county, she has been against that because of that issue. Others support it, but you know, she's really looking at that closely. So Jim, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, gentlemen, for being here with us this morning. Chief Smith, I wanted to.
Yeah. And Sheri Crain's not a gentleman.
Well, that is very true. Gentle lady. I had not thought about the aspect of local control, local control over law enforcement operations, that kind of thing. Thanks for bringing that up. My question is a larger one. In some jurisdictions, I think it's a fair thing to say that the overall relaxation of police operations, the diminution of police operations, has effectively been taken by the folks who are inclined toward criminal behavior as permission to do more of the same, because it has lowered their risk calculus. They don't see as much of a risk anymore with getting caught, being held accountable, et cetera, and so forth. Whether that's true and correct or not, at least that's seems to be the perception. How much here in Clallam County, in your experience, your collective experience, has that phenomenon taken hold? My impression is that hasn't had much of an effect on the criminal segment of our society here. But from your perspective, what has that done toward the risk calculation of the criminal elements toward incentivizing their criminal behavior? I'll just leave it like that.
So Jim, I'll dive into that, but I know Sheri has something to say about it based on what's happened to them in Sequim. But so you're talking about people from out of the area, let's say, that live in the urban space, that's, the I-5 corridor, that are used to police either engaging or not engaging with them, and they're used to a certain response and a certain posture. And in the last 2 years, that's substantially changed in the urban areas. I would argue that, like in Port Angeles, it hasn't changed. I mean, we had been practicing de-escalation, the best practices. I mean, we've been working on making ourselves better, but we haven't, like after the pursuit bill here, we determined that we could use the reasonable suspicion standard for DUI on a pursuit if it was there, and pursue someone if it was safe to do so. We made that decision. Probably only 10% of the agencies in the state were comfortable doing that, but we were. But to the offender, this has been studied by academics for years and years. They do a perceptual shorthand, and the problem with a criminal offender doing perceptual shorthand, they're not necessarily accurate. And if you think about the math they do in their head, and the fact that we rely on voluntary compliance, the laws are designed to be followed. They're not really designed to be enforced. If we have to enforce everything, the world goes dark pretty quickly. It's, we all agree to register our cars, not steal things, obey the law, get driver's license. We all do it. For the most part, all of us comply. So all it takes to damage this social fabric is for the offenders to perceive that the police can't do anything. And I've seen it on when we've arrested people who are from other urban spaces who are offended that they're now being arrested. And they're like, you can't, and you can fill in the blank. And I can think of the pursuit we had up to Carlsberg, where we pitted a driver who was a DUI, impaired on drugs, and we pitted him 3 times. We totaled his car, and we had to push his vehicle into a ditch to stop it from moving. And that, that involved risk to the public. We did thousands of dollars damage to our own vehicles, but the driver of that vehicle made it pretty clear that where he's from in urban Washington, the police can't chase him. And he was really surprised that we would. It just takes that kind of perception, the coverage of the story, the notion that the police can't do anything. And that's one of the things we're going to have to pull back as we move forward. But I mean, Sheri can tell you some stories where Sequim has been very successful in interdicting criminals, investigating and arresting them, but they brought that behavior here with the idea that they could get away with it.
Yeah, I agree. And Jim, the stories are, almost every major crime spree that we've had in the city of Sequim in the last 2 years has been, believe it or not, folks from Tacoma. So we've made it a point of pride for us to close those cases to include driving to Tacoma, Kent, Puyallup, wherever it is, and getting those arrests and bringing them back and having them face justice in our court system. And of course, they're shocked when we do that. Matter of fact, those law enforcement agencies have been shocked when we've shown up asking for their assistance to go arrest somebody. So I would say that that's certainly part of it, and that is affecting us, which is why this state legislation is so impactful, because we're sometimes the recipient of unintended criminal behavior from other parties coming in from the outside. What I would suggest on the other side, that perception part that Brian was talking about, clearly the criminals perceive. Well, one of the things that Sequim has always done is you try to be visible, you try to be out there, you try and be active, and you're trying to discourage people from doing those. And it works with our own criminal element for sure. But the flip side to that is that I would encourage our population, our community, to call, right? Don't assume that we're not going to be able to do anything. Don't assume that we can't respond. I want you to call all the time, every time. And we'll do what we can with it, right? Based on the law and our resources. But I think that's the difference in the urban core, where people are no longer calling and cops are no longer responding to things because they're either understaffed or by policy they've been restricted.
Right. May I just make a further apology and comment, Colleen? Sheri, I'm profusely apologetic for mischaracterizing you. I plead lack of caffeine. I'm still working on my first cup of coffee.
No problem. No problem, Jim. Thanks.
And I think the point Brian raised earlier about the and both Brian's raised about the quality or the qualified immunity issue. That is the hill to die on. We must fight that with everything that we have. It will be impossible to budget from a county or city perspective if you're uninsurable and you have unlimited liability. You will have to make sure that our police forces understand that we have their back financially. And therefore that becomes a profound budgeting problem for the local jurisdictions that involve police forces. So that's something that we must fight at all costs.
Yeah, I just want to add that I put into the chat the Senate's proposed capital budget for the for this next 2-year biennium, and it includes 25.745 million on top of the 2.5 million that the Jamestown tribe has already received from the state to build a behavioral health facility behind Costco, basically in Sequim. But and that would be a center that would, and where people that are in a mental health crisis could be brought to, because currently people go to the ER and they take up ER beds, and while they're being looked at for involuntary treatment on a hold to evaluate should they be treated there or involuntarily admitted, and if they do, then they have to be sent to another county, and if not, then they're released if they're not a danger to themselves or others. But that doesn't mean they're not in a mental health crisis. So yeah, it's certainly needed in our community. Representative Theringer, however, told me at the EDC annual gala that, the ask had been initially 34 million and then 25 million. And now it's down to, he said he was only going to be able to support 13 million because they were 400 million in the hole. And he was looking under couch cushions trying to find, he said they found it. So that's a pretty darn big couch if you can find 400 million in the couch cushions. But he found that 400 million, but said, he thought that the House side was only going to be 13 million and they were going to have to rectify that between the two budgets. So the good thing is we will eventually have a facility in Sequim to serve the community. And again, it's absolutely needed. That the part of the reason why there's such a long wait in the ER is because once someone's brought into the ER on an involuntary hold, until they're medically evaluated, like is the psychosis potentially being caused by something other than drugs or a mental health condition, they have to figure out, do a complete workup. Is it physically related? And that can take 8 hours. And so they're holding that bed until they're evaluated. Whereas if there was a mental health facility, that would open up the ER. So anyway, I got a good briefing on this recently and found it all very interesting.
So Colleen, something to add
yes.
to this very quickly, since you're talking about the facility in Sequim, which we'd be very excited about. One of the challenges we find is that when you look at these complex problems, you don't look at them holistically. Untreated mental illness and the damage from fentanyl, heroin, and methamphetamine is really destructive on people. I mean, those are medical practitioners that are on this could talk better than I about this, but repairing people, getting them back once they're there is extremely difficult. We support it, and these are human beings, so we don't want them on the trash heap. However, not looking at it like what we've been through in the last couple of years, where drugs like fentanyl are essentially, we have really no enforcement power over the possession of them. And the use of them very quickly heavily damages people. People that don't even realize how much trouble they're going to get into. They are really, really harmed, and it's going to take all of us to bring them back. While meantime, our drug task force tells us the price of fentanyl has dropped over 50%. It's trending downward. It's more available, and that product comes almost exclusively across the southern border. So, making it easier to have the thing, like the police are no longer people you need to worry about when you deal with them, and the fact that it's cheaper, and by product development, the fentanyl that's out there is becoming more destructive. It's in the heroin, and it's it's not precisely made. It's not made any standards. So we're encountering all those things. So it's not just treatment in beds. It's also being able to have some enforcement capacity to stop what's happening. Unfortunately for us, in the last couple of years, we've really every direction except for the money that supports our treatment, our rediscovery program, the original MAT program, I think was known, and the county jail both did that, 7 years ago. Those are great moves forward, but the problem on the other end is continuing, and we're faced with those challenges. So we ask our legislators and everybody to look at this as, everything's connected. It's all interrelated.
Mhm. Dr. Maxwell,
Yeah,
do you want to?
good morning. Yeah, I just wanted to just reinforce what Chief Smith said. He's spot on. The fentanyl is in virtually everything now. Our provider is seeing it. Almost 100% of people are testing positive for fentanyl, no matter what they're using. And the availability is, as you mentioned, is just becoming greater because it's cheap and it's lethal. So it is just a huge issue, and it's makes it so much harder to treat medically because of its potency and it's a short duration. It just affects the addiction behaviors substantially. So it is a big challenge, and he's also correct in that, as I put a little comment in the chat box, the treatment facility, getting it built is going to be a major undertaking, and it's a challenge. But once it's built, I can tell you, getting it staffed is going to be really hard. I'm not sure where they're going to come from. But so we'll have to work on that in parallel, and that's a whole other issue. And then the other part of it is once you can get them in a facility that has a staff to take care of them, the underlying factors that led to their addiction, there's complex social factors that you can't just, it's not like going in and getting treated for appendicitis. It's a very complex, ongoing, often recurring cycle that is exhausting, but you have to keep trying, because if you don't, you give up. But so he's right, it's all interconnected and very complex.
Following up on that, as I recall, I've been told that the reason why Jamestown would be running the behavioral clinic is because based in federal law, they get reimbursed at 103%. So it was going to be OMC that staffed it, and they would charge Jamestown their costs. And then Jamestown would get reimbursed Medicaid, primarily maybe Medicare, at 103% of whatever they're charged. So wouldn't it be this lower amount that OMC normally gets reimbursed for, 60 to 65%? But so, and you're talking about the staffing issue, and if OMC can, have a higher reimbursement rate, I would think they could also probably have a higher, more competitive salaries. Is that going to be a problem for Known and PBH, that they'll be pulling all of the staff because they'll be paying more?
When you have a limited workforce, it begins, musical chairs. So there is always that risk. And if the primary driver for for somebody seeking a position is the salary, then certainly those factors can play into it. But I think it's even getting to that point, there's a broader issue is that we just have to train more people. There's just, OMC, I think, no matter how much there's a limit to how much they can offer, but even if they did, there's no people to go. There's only so many people have moved from Jamestown or known to OMC or to the treatment facility. We just need more people to train, and I guess these workforce training bills that are for the legislature that increasing the workforce in general is critical to solving this problem.
Thank you. Jim Hagwood, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, good morning. My question with regard to, could you sort of describe what the current status and capacity is of the prosecutor's office? Obviously, there's a carrot and a stick approach to this, and I'm wondering about the stick here and what kinds of consequences are we able to instill into the community for poor behavior?
I think there's a will. The problem is they're having significant staffing just like the rest of us. But we have great working relationships with those folks. I think they're in it and doing good work. Absent some staffing issues, I have no problems with their charging and their desires to push forward with cases. From the Sequim end of things, we've been very happy with their work product and what they're doing, especially at the felony level. They're working really hard. They've had a lot of homicides, a lot of persons crimes, some intense cases that require a lot of effort. So I think they're doing what they can with the resources they've got, but they're not dissimilar to the rest of us. They're a little short-staffed right now.
And Jim, I will add that much like we at the sheriff's office had to do, we had to approach our county commissioners, look for retention and hiring incentives. And currently Mark and his office are looking to engage the prosecutor or the board on getting funding for that as well. But much like law enforcement, much like mental health, much like our hospitals, they're having trouble getting attorneys to even apply. And so when they put out those applications, they're lucky to get 1 or 2 applicants when they're out there looking. So it's been a challenge for them. I will say that they're also suffering from the same legislation that we are as far as having that stick, especially when we look at trying to incentivize treatment with folks who are highly addicted to some of these strong drugs like fentanyl. And I wanted to add one hard number when we start to talk about fentanyl and its prevalence in our community. And this is from a task force perspective, that in 2021, we seized 279 dosage units, which are essentially counterfeit oxycodone pills that are really pills containing fentanyl. And in 2022, that number from 279 jumped to 17,386 dosage units. So that just highlights the problem that we have when it comes to illicit fentanyl in our community. And because of that supply, I mean, a dosage unit right now it will cost the average user about $5.
Yeah, I'd like to carry on that conversation. I mean, we are one of the few counties that still continues to have a operating drug task force. And I think we all collectively decided that we need to make that commitment. You need to have a balanced approach to this problem. You can't do all on the treatment side. It's got to be a little bit of demand and supply. So we're going after people who are bringing it. It's an interesting story. I want to tell the story, and maybe Brian has other comments about it. But our OPNET detective that's assigned to OPNET told this story of him talking to a dealer that they're in the process of prosecuting, and he's like, "Hey, we don't want to bring fentanyl here. We know it's going to kill people. We don't want to bring fentanyl here." But that just tells you the power of the entrepreneurial spirit of these drug makers that are coming out of China and Mexico. They're willing to flood the market. They're willing to do whatever it takes to break into that market. So we had people here that were fighting this. Fentanyl's been around for close to 10 years. It's been around for a while. It really hasn't been a significant problem in Clallam County until the last 2 or 3 years. And it is a significant problem, but we are one of the few counties still trying to approach drug enforcement on the dealer end of end of the spectrum.
So other counties aren't then?
So the Kitsap County, Colleen, disbanded their drug task force post 2021, and the use of force uncertainties and some other things that appeared to make sense for them. We never even considered doing that. And there's other jurisdictions in Washington that did the same thing. They and really they should be able to speak for themselves, but I was shocked when I heard that. And so none of those things help us, but like if you live in a zip code where your county or your city disbanded your drug task force, I would recommend you ask your elected some hard questions about that. I mean, like Sheri said, we can't simply be reactive and treatment oriented. We have to be also proactive. I'm really proud of the work that our OPNET task force has done. You know, it's a federal, state, local, and county work group. And Sheri's detective, just to give him a little bit of credit, has spent time in a state that borders the southern border, because that's where the case was. And he's down there working with the DEA and locals on our case in Arizona, interdicting drugs before they even get here. That's our posture. And we think it's like the world would be much worse if we weren't operating that way. And we never even considered doing it any differently. That was never a subject for us to talk about, that we were gonna walk away from that. You know, so you know, if you look at the stuff holistically, it's really a crime ecosystem. All the pieces have to work. And I echo Brian and Sheri on our prosecutor. They do incredible work. It's extremely difficult for them just on a good day when they're fully staffed. The way the legal system and the courts work in Washington, it's a hard job, but they can't operate without full staffing. And the only variable they really control is time. So the time it takes to prosecute a case, to accept a case, purely for them, it's based on their resources. But in some of the areas where we've eliminated some criminal elements and organizations, there's not a case anymore because we prosecuted them. They're incarcerated, they're out of business. It isn't an endless problem that it doesn't matter what you do. We've actually made significant progress and removed certain offenders from here. It's just a problem that it takes us to have all the resources plugged in and running at full speed.
So with I'm wondering the amount of the caseload that you have that's happening. There's more fentanyl, more and lower price point. But with the Blake decision and these changes about possessing a illegal substance not being something that you can arrest for, has that reduced the number of actual arrests and prosecutions that are occurring that are going through the system locally?
No. So Colleen, I mean, without studying it scientifically, and my colleagues will have something to say about this, we either have the opportunity to interdict stuff at a low level, like a misdemeanor arrest or a referral to services, or we have the opportunity not to interdict at a low level, and we can wait for the person who's desperate to commit thefts, other crimes, get involved in violence. So our caseload simply has shifted. People, like, we have the highest overdose death rate in the state. Like, those are real things that really impact. We would prefer to handle things at the lower level. In other words, be upstream, you know, misdemeanor, infraction, treatment, that kind of thing. Post Blake, where we've gone with a lot of people in their situation, it has to get really bad before we can do anything. And again, that some of that was by legislative design to take us out of the picture and make law enforcement in Washington passive and reactive. That was purposeful thinking in 2021. That, and there's people that believe that, like they could tell you why they believe we should be more passive and more reactive. So maybe case numbers total can drop, but the seriousness of them will increase. And I can't think of a property crime in Port Angeles that doesn't have a substance use nexus. I mean, I'm always looking, you just find one, because when you're in a desperate situation, you know, really what does it matter whether you're involved in property crime? If you're really desperate, you're really struggling. The when I take people on ride-alongs, I'll take them to places I know where people are at, and I can have really good conversations, polite conversations with people, like who've got, say, a tent pitched, and they could say, "Hey, I got to go for a second. They'll go inside the tent, use illegal drugs, and come back out and talk to me." And again, it's that's a case that doesn't get made. You know, there's a criminal case that we don't make until it gets worse. At least that's my perspective, that we've designed a system right now that's allowing things to get worse before we get involved. And there's the impact on the system.
What's driving Clallam County having the highest overdose rate in the state?
I think we struggle with that all the time. Why is that the case? Is it access to treatment? Is it some of this legislation? I don't have that answer, and I don't think many of us do. I will say, when we talk about, Brian's answer to how we've had to shift our enforcement practices at the task force level, what we can't do with the current legislation is we're really not affecting immediate change within our community. I mean, we've had to push our investigative practice up several levels, and so what I'm talking about is we're targeting a lot of higher end drug traffickers that are trafficking in large amounts of fentanyl. But the visible impact that we can have on our communities on that just isn't there. And so our practice had always been, we start at the bottom, we move to the top. Well, we're going directly to the top now. So those drug houses, while we continue to try to work on the drug houses that really impact the quality of life here in the county, it's much more difficult for our citizens to be able to see that, even though we're still doing amazing work at the higher end of the spectrum. It's really trying to solve individual problems within the community that we really struggle with. And one last point, with Sheri's comment about that balance between enforcement and treatment, some of our successes and what we do see with our affiliation, both Sheri and I are on the Healing Clinic Community Advisory Committee. We are able to see some of the cases that we're doing out in the community. For example, a drug house that we took down in Port Angeles a couple months ago correlate to higher admissions into the clinic because we cleaned up that one house, and the clinic shares with us that, okay, folks from that drug trafficking organization, that network, those people that relied on those drugs are now seeing an increase in admissions. And so we can't abandon the enforcement aspect of any of this because we do see that positive impact in the community.
Mm-hmm. So a dose of fentanyl is $5. How long does that last for the user? Do they have to do that 5 times a day or 1 time a day? What?
It's certainly dependent upon the user, but we've heard everything from, 1 dose to 5 doses. And so, there is a spectrum of use there depending on the tolerance of the individual. Where we begin to see the overdoses and the overdose increase is, especially after release from jail. Let's say you come in and you're dosing at a certain level prior, to entry into jail. You're released if you don't have a good release plan, and you jump back to that, let's say 5 doses a day immediately afterwards. That's where that risk truly increased, but it just has to do with the individual user.
So, Colleen, you have to think also the whole concept of illicit drugs. So if it doesn't have a label, if it hasn't been evaluated by the FDA, let's say, it's not prescribed by a doctor, and it's highly dangerous in the wrong dose. Really since the late 60s, I mean, some people can remember that, illicit drugs became part of mainstream America. And, the UW Addiction Institute has done a really lot of great work on this. Once people accept the idea that an illicit substance is okay and you can consume it, you're literally, sort of spinning, you're rolling the dice here. Fentanyl, if I understand it, doesn't package well it concentrates. So like somebody's supply of fentanyl could have a highly concentrated amount contained within like those little fake oxy pills. They're not the same dose. They're, you know, so why are more people doing that here? I think there's this historical record to Clallam County and addiction that goes back many years. But once people accept the idea that illicit drugs, like think about the idea of like different jurisdictions want to facilitate it, like you could show up and it could be medically supervised, but this sort of random unknown substance, you know, it's okay to administer it to yourself, and you just accept the risks that go with it. Really, that's a societal problem right there. That like me as a law enforcement leader, I want to go upstream and problem solve, but I don't tell anybody that illicit drug use is okay. And we have a mechanism in Washington right now with marijuana that it's, you know, it was a voter initiative. It's legal on the state side. It's not legal on the federal side. So you have to ask yourself, why didn't our federal legislators, after 10 years, sponsor federal legislation to allow it federally to be legal? So it's not legal. You know, my daughter questions me on this when we drive by the pot shops, but I'm like, Title 18, it's not legal, it's a crime. But it's also a substance that doesn't have a label, doesn't have an FDA label on it. It's being used recreation and with, you know, and as medicine by some people, with the actual lack of the normal things that we do with drugs in our society. And it's a really big jump once you go there and you say, well, I guess illicit stuff will just be okay, like we did post Blake. You know, you live with the consequences.
Mhm. All right, well, Sheriff King and Chief Crain and Chief Smith, thank you so much for joining us today. We're a little bit over, but this is such an important topic, and hopefully we can have you guys come back. We had a lot of items in the chat requesting that in a couple months and see what has come out of the legislative session, and hopefully you all can give us an update. So again, thank you so much, and have a great day. This video will be on our website if you want to share it with others. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Colleen.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.